I got big enough, I can remember after Brother Smith and Aunt Hen he was the Methodist minister here, and they moved to Brentwood, Tennessee. And so I don't remember what age I was then, maybe junior or senior in high school. Mother would take me to Crossville, put me on the train, and I'd take the train to Nashville and take voice and piano lessons and stay with Brother Smith and Aunt Hen and sing in their choir at Brentwood Methodist Church. And that's where I met Alan McDowell. Now, I was probably 15, and he was already in college, and I started dating him there, and he was an engineer at Vultee. Well, I don't know how long this went on that I took the train and stayed with them, but quite a while, quite a few months at least, and I started dating Alan. And Alan asked me to come to an engineering dance. Now, about May of that year, I turned 17 and was supposed to go with Alan to this engineering dance. Well, I did. He picked me up, and we were supposed to drive at Aunt Hen's, and we were supposed to drive to his parents, and I was supposed to meet them, and then we were going on to the Andrew Jackson Stables, which had been turned into a lovely restaurant. We were going to have dinner there and then go on to the dance. Well, we went by his parents first. He wanted to introduce me to his parents, and Frank Seesock was there. This was early in the war effort, and they had called all the engineers to come out of college that were still in college and go into the workforce, to go from making washing machines and refrigerators and stoves to making planes and guns and ammunition. And Nashville had just been inundated with engineers pouring in from all over to Vultee. I don't know what they were developing at Vultee at that particular time, but Frank and his father and one of his best friends had been at Republic in New York, and they came to Vultee. But anyway, he was going to be renting a room from Dr. and Miss McDowell, and people in Nashville were letting them rent rooms because the influx of whatever was happening at that time. I was not much interested in that, as I was going to dances and singing and everything. But anyway, we went by Alan's, and I met Frank at his parents' house that night. And he was absolutely terrible. But I couldn't see anybody else after that. Alan said, "Frank, are you going to the dance or not?" And Frank looks at me and he said, "Well, I wasn't going to, but I am." Damn Yankee. Saying that right in front of Alan and his parents. Anyway, then he had the brass to ask Alan to drive him by where he was staying at the time, and Alan did. And then when we got to the dance, Frank Seesock cut in on me, took me away from and the place was jammed. It was at the Andrew Jackson, and it was packed. I'm barely 17 years old. That's the first dance I had ever been to in my life. This was my first real serious boyfriend. And Frank takes me away from the table and won't take me back, and I don't know what to do. If I had time to think about it, I would have, but anyway, when we finally got back to the table, Alan was stewing. And Frank had the gall to say, "Would you take me by and drop me off at house on the way home from the dance. In the car, Frank got a hold of my hand and never would turn it loose. When we dropped him off and when Alan took me to Aunt Hen's, instead of getting out of the car, and he was a perfect Southern gentleman, he just reached across, opened the door, and said good night. I'm back in Jamestown. Frank Seesock is calling me from Alan's living room to make a date. And not only that, I don't remember the sequence now, but he invites himself to come up and visit me. I don't know how he got from Crossville to Jamestown, but Uncle Clarence called and said, there's a Yankee standing out here on the corner of the store, and he looks lost to me. Do you know anything about this? And I thought, oh dear Lord. So I quickly run over to the store, and Frank's standing out on that corner where 52 and 127 cross, and he's looking from one end of Jamestown to the other end of Jamestown. And he looks like Joe College. I mean, he's dressed with the sleeveless sweater and the plaid jacket. I told Frank, I said, Daddy has a beauty shop, a barber shop, a grocery store, a men's and women's store, a funeral home, and a farm. And smart aleck Frank said, who owns the bank and the theater? Oh, the wise guy. But anyway, I take him to all the wonderful spots like Point Lookout and down in the river to see Sergeant York's, and we go out to see the farm, of course. Well, we get out there, and they had apparently been butchering an animal, as you could during the war then, and this man had cut himself something terrible, and Frank goes in and fixes him up. He knew how to clean out the wound and bandage it and everything, so Daddy kind of softened a little bit. But anyway, I have introduced a damn Yankee into the family that never recovered when you think about it. But anyway, it was, I continued to date him, and then he and all the engineers, his father and Curly Peacock that was down there with him, they're all called to McDonald's in St. Louis. So he moves to St. Louis, and I'm on my way to UT. Frank came every time I'd sing at a sorority thing or something like that. Frank would show up. Mother and Daddy would show up. When I was in the beauty contest, Mother and Daddy and Ernest and Liza came to chaperone. We had anything like that. And remember, Frank was traveling by train from St. Louis by train to Knoxville because it was wartime. Now, Frank had a presidential deferment because he was in the war effort, and he was deferred because he was an engineer and contributing to the war effort. I quit hearing from Frank. This was the summer before we left for the casements. His letters just stopped, and I wrote him, and I just didn't hear from him. It just broke my heart. Barbara said, well, I'm glad you're hearing from Frank again. I said, she worked at the post office. I said, no, I'm not. I'm not hearing from him. I haven't heard from him in months. She said, I wondered if you were getting the letters. So I left her my address at the casements. I got back there, and there was a letter from Frank. He was in the Navy, stationed in Pensacola. I lied and told Mother that I had been invited to these friends that lived up and to get permission to leave school, and went up and spent the weekend with Frank. And he was on his way then to the South Pacific. I never did confront Mother with that. I don't know if she knew or not, but, and I've often wondered what would have happened if Barbara hadn't worked at the post office or hadn't told me that or something. But I've always been thankful. But wasn't that mean? But anyway, they wanted me to marry Jimmy. I never did confront Mother with her destroying the letters, but I did tell them I was going to marry Frank. And they weren't nice about it at all, and I was such a weak-livered thing. I let Mother talk me out of what I wanted to do, so I wrote Frank a Dear John that he held over my head forever. And then I wrote and told him that I was living in Brooklyn. Well, somehow he got them to give him another bit of leave, and he called me and said he would meet me at Pennsylvania Station at such and such a time, and for me to be there. I'm walking around trying to be sure I don't miss him, and all of a sudden this sailor comes up to me and says, "Are you going to marry me, or am I going to shove you in front of this next train that's coming by?" And I meekly said, "I'm going to marry you." I'm sure it wasn't that meek, but anyway, that was my lovely proposal from my husband. Either marry me or... And I don't know how many days now, but he took me on to the USS North Carolina, and I got to see not down in it or anything like that, but the ship he was on. And that was kind of fun. And then I came back, and he took me out to Perth Amboy to meet his mother and Arthur. And we walk in, and now I'd had all this trouble with my parents about marrying him. We walk in, and Frank says, "Mom, this is the girl I'm going to marry." And Frank's mother says, "That's nice." What a contrast. And she was wonderful. So anyway, I don't remember all the sequence now, but he does get time off, and he comes down, and oh, the ship moves down to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was handy. And but by that time, I'm staying with his mother and getting ready to be married. Frank is arranging everything. We went to the Catholic church, and I wasn't Catholic, and the priest kept trying to get me to say I'd raise my children Catholic, and I kept saying, "No, there's no Catholic church in Jamestown, that's where we're going to live." I know I was taking a chance, but anyway, Frank finally said to him, "If you don't want to marry us, we'll go down here and this Methodist minister will marry us." So he not very graciously changed his mind and married us. And Frank's grandmother, by then I'd met all the aunts and uncles and the grandparents and everything, and it was a real cultural difference. But I loved it. They accepted me just beautifully. Grandmother, Frank's mother's mother, had a dinner for us after we were married, and had all the relatives there, and I met a lot of them. And Frank's father came up from wherever he was at that time for that. And then he had a dinner for us that night at the hotel there in Perth Amboy. And I met all the younger people from Frank's friends all over. And all of that. And then we take the train to Jamestown. You don't take a train to Jamestown. We took the train to Crossville. And then Uncle Fonzo was there with his cab, and we took that to Jamestown. And all the way, Uncle Fonzo is looking back like, what is she doing? And I introduced Frank as my husband, and we pulled up in front of the house, and I go in by myself, and I say, "Mother and Daddy, Frank and I are married," and he's in the car. So I don't know, they were gracious. They were in the middle of having lunch and they were gracious, and Frank and I went in, and then I found out later they went to call on our minister. And while we were in Jamestown, Mother and Daddy gave a reception for us and sent out invitations, an announcement invitation that we had married, and had a very nice reception. Aunt Carrie gave us a shower, and so we were entertained while we were there. And I don't remember how long we stayed in Jamestown, and Frank had to be back to the Navy. His time was running out. So his mother and he agreed that I would stay with them, with Mom and Arthur, while Frank was still in the Navy up there. And I don't remember how many months that he was there, but oh, it was cold. It was so cold. Now remember, I had been a year in school in Florida and moved to New York City and Perth Amboy. Well, I stayed in school while Frank was still in the Navy, and since he was so close, he could come home at least once a week, and oh, was it cold. Anyway, we were there for a few months, and I finished up at school. Bob came home from the service. He'd been in the Army for 37 months and had been on the front line all the way up from landing in North Africa and going all the way up the Italian boot and into Berchtesgaden when the war was over, and he didn't get home until July. That was why he was not in our wedding. Johnny Weversock was Frank's best man. He was a good friend of Frank's, and Elaine was my my maid of honor at that time, and she was Bob's girlfriend. She'd been his girlfriend since the 6th grade. Anyway, we stayed there until Frank's ship left to go to Beaumont, Texas to be put in mothballs. And so I went home. I took the train and went to Jamestown to stay, and stayed with Mother and Daddy. And I think that was when I lost the first baby. I'm not real sure about that, but I know I wasn't very well, and I went home for a while to Jamestown, and somewhere stopped in Knoxville and met Joe. Kitten had started dating Joe, and then I moved to. At that time, I was moving home to Jamestown, and Frank was on his ship headed for Texas. I went to work at the store for Daddy. Frank came to Jamestown sometime to visit, and Daddy was still buying property. And we went out to this auction that was having Miss Greer's home and land was being auctioned off, and Daddy was interested in it for a funeral home. And Frank and I were with him, and he bought it. And it was a big old farmhouse, rough, but good looking and good bones, as they say. And I guess Frank got kind of a education on what Jamestown was like. Now, I had seen what Perth Amboy and New York were like, and believe me, they were worlds apart. It was, oh, I was going to love Frank's family. I was going to do everything I could to make them love me. And I knew it was a big cultural difference, but I could do it. And I did, and it was so much fun. It really was a different world. The first thing I do, Frank's uncles and everybody, we'd go out to this, I guess it was like a nightclub, and they had a cymbalum, which is like a Hungarian piano, and it plucks the strings like the old, instead of the hammers, but it's beautiful. And the first thing they did was teach me a shardash. A shardash is a Hungarian dance, and I was little and skinny, and they throw you around. They pick you up and twirl you around, and I absolutely loved it, and they did, and it was just had a good time. When we go home, and Frank's finally going to get out of the Navy, it was really a rough existence that neither one of us had ever been through. But we were young and in love, and it didn't matter that we didn't have running water, and that we didn't have an indoor bathroom, and all kinds of things that you wouldn't believe that you could exist without. Frank's father came down to visit us, and he was so horrified that he went home and sent me an electric blanket, which was heavenly, and Frank an electric razor, and we had a ball. We went to work, and of course all the guys that had gotten out of the service, they immediately wanted to form a Veterans of Foreign Wars. They had a American Legion there, but the new vets wanted to form a Veterans of, and they elected Frank commander. My Yankee husband, the commander of the VFW, and Frank fit into that place like, well, just incredible. It really was just incredible. We'd go home from work, and our house would already be full of people, and I remember Denton Burden coming in, and he had a stack of bologna about this high and crackers, and they're already in the house making themselves at home and getting a party ready for us. And they brought records in, and we had record players, and we danced and had just tons of fun. And that happened night after night after night. Saturday nights, that's when you played, and it was fun. Maybe a year or so later, Sikorsky Aircraft in Trenton was hiring and needed a weights engineer, and the salary offer was just fabulous. We couldn't turn it down. So we moved back to New Jersey, and Frank starts working at Sikorsky. I was invited along with all the wives to a dinner that Sikorsky gave for his engineers and his designers and all those people, and saw firsthand how respected, almost more than respected, Frank's father was in the aircraft business. Dad invented and designed many innovative things in all kinds of aircraft. He was known all over the country with the Doolittle was a friend of his. Mother came up to visit us, and she offered Frank, she wanted Frank to come back and work for Daddy. So she made him a really good offer, so we moved back to Jamestown.